Okay, so we're going to introduce actually the French Aug Sixth chord today.
Cool.
And this is an excerpt from the third movement of the Pathetique Sonata by Beethoven. And let me, as best I can. There's a couple of measures of music that precede this, and then the excerpt ends with 3 chords. This is the harmony we're going to look at, and the first time through, I'm going to play it as simply a repetition of this chord, and then we're going to talk about how Beethoven manipulates this harmony. Okay? So let me play it first. I think this will make sense as I start to play it. So the excerpt is, and then here are the 3 chords, ending on the 5 chord. Does that make sense? Okay. So as I have it written, this would be the 4/6 repeated,
Right.
right, and then ending on 5. Okay? The 4/6 is probably, the inversion is not what is important. The chord, actually, I'm sorry, I don't know why I wrote that as lowercase 4.
I was going to say, why?
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
It's a major 4 chord. The 4 chord would be the weakest of our predominant chords that move us towards the 5/7. Right? It's pretty plain vanilla.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? You and I have not done the 2 chord lecture, but the basic idea behind the 2 chord is that it's a substitute for 4. This will make very good sense to you as a jazz player.
Yeah, 2-5-4.
Yeah. Don't do 4/5-1, do 2/5-1.
Yeah.
Right? And if we're looking here at E flat, that makes good intuitive sense, because if you look at the 4 chord in E flat and compare it to the 2 chord in E flat, they're cousins. They are almost the same harmony. It's really just one note different, right? And the other thing that we learn is that often the 2 chord, like the 5 chord, takes a 7th all the way back to Mozart, in classical Bach. The 2 harmonies in Baroque and classical period that typically take 7ths are the 5/7, of course, but the 2/7 also. And the reason is that gives you 3 common tones with the 5. You're basically just sort of adding this undertone sort of thing. So it recolors the 4 chord with the addition of that other note. And so in this context, if I wanted to look at that substitution of 2/7 for 4 as a predominant, one way I could consider that is simply by adding to this harmony the F. Does that make sense? Making this now 2/4/3. Okay? So by adding an extra note to that harmony, 4/6 becomes 2/4/3. And that strengthens the overall sense of resolution to the dominant. Instead of, right?
Yeah.
Okay? Now, in a minor key, incidentally, had we been in E flat minor instead of, I can write my flats on the right lines, there we go. E flat relative of G flat there. Does that make sense? Okay? The difference in E flat minor is that this C would become C flat, making this a half diminished chord. Does that make sense? And what we learn about the 2 chord is that, 2/7 in major is just fine, but the 2 half diminished 7 from the minor key that takes that 5th and lowers it, right, is even stronger still. And it is perfectly acceptable in a major key to borrow chords from the parallel minor, particularly those that have flat 6, just to strengthen the overall sense of harmony. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in other words, even though we would expect the major 2/4/3 in E flat major, it is possible to borrow 2 half diminished 4/3 from the parallel minor, and all that means is we're adding a flat to the C here. Does that make sense? And in so doing, we've now strengthened the motion towards 5 even more strongly. Sorry. Right?
Yeah.
And that sounds the best of what we've done thus far because it's a much more dissonant harmony. Diminished chords are more dissonant by definition. But it also creates this very nice descending half-step bass line.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so of the example, you know, starting with just 4, 2, 4, 3, but now 2, right, is especially nice because of that descending bass line.
Yep.
Okay. Another possibility, though, however, in this moment, rather than 2 half diminished 4, 3, is actually look at the secondary dominant of 5. Look at 5's 5, 7. Just want to talk about 5, 7, and 5. Mm-hmm. So in other words, if 5 in E flat is a B flat major chord, we can think about, well, what is 5, 7 in B flat and borrow that harmony, which would be the F major 7th, a natural E flat. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, and so if we were going to take this concept of 5, 7 of 5 and place it here in this inversion, it would now be 5, 4, 3 of 5, and that would require the A natural. Does that make sense? Again, just looking at what are all the possibilities that we could use at this moment to propel the motion towards the 5 chord. And so the use of 5, 4, 3 of 5 in this progression Does that make sense? And of course what we're doing there is actually now creating some half-step motion ascending with the A natural. And so what I've kind of done is presented various ways in which Beethoven could have chosen harmonies for this moment. And then in the textbook there's the big reveal moment of, well, what did he actually do? And the answer is this. Which is what?
He combined them.
He combined them. He did both. He did the upward half-step motion in the treble of 5, 4, 3 of 5 with the downward half-step motion of 2 half diminished 4, 3. Sorry, just 2 half diminished 4, 3. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And what I'm really trying to get students to understand is what we're talking about is various flavors of harmonies that are all cousins.
Yeah.
They're basically, they're all predominant chords. It's just what accidentals do you use to create them. And in Baroque period even, but certainly through the classical period, what begins to develop is this sort of combination of the lower, in this case C flat, of the 2 half diminished 7th chord, with the raised A natural in this key of the 5, 7 of 5. Combining both of those accidentals into a single harmony. Okay? Now the best way to think about that harmony, how do we conceive why that happened, is you're taking 5, 7 of 5 and you're flatting the 5th. Because, right, because the C flat here, does that make sense?
Yeah.
But the typical inversion that this sort of altered chord now appears in is with this sort of descending bass line. Certainly with the C flat resolving to the B flat in the bass. And if you're talking about moving to a 5 root position chord, which you pretty much are, if that makes sense, it's that descending motion here that makes this harmony really work.
Yeah.
So in other words, we're altering the pitch, but it's actually a bass note that we're altering.
Yes.
Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah.
And if you can wrap your mind around that, then you really begin to understand what we call the augmented 6 chords in a way that I think can trip students up. Okay? But the basic concept is we're taking predominant chords. We're looking at all the different ways predominant chords can be used and spelled. They're all cousins of one another. And we're looking at the two that involve some accidentals and simply using both accidentals. But the way to sort of conceive that is we start with 5, 7 of 5, we flat the 5th, and we put that flat 5th in the bass. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that creates, the name we call that is the French augmented 6 chord. There is nothing particularly French about the chord. It's not that the French used it more than the others. It's just at some point people gave them geographic names. Beethoven will use French. This is Beethoven. I mean, he's using French augmented 6. He's German. That doesn't matter. Okay, but for whatever reason, this one just got named the French augmented sixth. It is the 5/7 flat 5 with a flat 5 in the bass, if that makes sense. There are 1,000 ways to think about augmented sixth chords, and I really struggle with what is the way to teach it. But if you can just commit to memory that French augmented sixth is 5/7 flat 5 with the
Yeah, because the 5 has to be in the bass because of the movement.
because of that movement, and that movement's critical. One thing to look at is that flat, right, is moving down by half step to 5, and that the other accidental is moving up by half step to 5. The accidentals that you are adding to the harmonies create half steps that resolve out to the octave on the dominant pitch. The reason these are called augmented sixth chords is that the interval of those two notes is actually an augmented sixth, if that makes sense. So it's the interval of the augmented sixth resolving out to 5. Okay. Now, although I've talked about the flatted fifth of the chord here, it really is helpful, and a lot of students will begin to memorize just scale degree patterns for these chords. I'm not against that. That's how I was actually taught. I will say if you make this simply a rote memorization trick, you'll know it for the final and will never remember it afterwards.
Yeah.
You know, so at some point you really got to wrap your mind around what really is this chord. Of course, this is where being a pianist is going to help.
Yeah.
And if you can really keep this in mind,